How's it going, everybody? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is a Chess.com weekend, and today we continue our Patterns Everyone Must Know series with the third installment in our mating nets portion, and I hope everyone's excited to be here. Moving on from the mating net themes that I guess the minor pieces, the knight and bishop, were the key players, at least as far as how I classified it. Obviously, there were other pieces that were just as important to making it happen. But moving on from those particular themes, I would like to jump into how the major pieces coordinate with different minor pieces and with each other for mating nets. It's a little bit mixed, but you'll see that there is a natural order of things and a kind of a hierarchy of how we're going to work through these mating nets. And we're going to get started, first of all, with the windmill or Morphy's mate. The mates that involve a seesaw type of pattern, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when we jump right in. Let's do it. First one here is designed just to highlight exactly what a windmill is, kind of an exaggerated or made-up version of the position. The windmill was a tactical pattern that we actually discussed in our introduction to basic tactical patterns and beyond the basics video. So I know that it's officially the windmill is considered more of a tactical pattern than it is a mating net. However, the windmill idea itself is directly associated with Morphy's mate and different types of seesaw patterns. So just to show you an example that I didn't give in the beyond the basics, the tactical patterns everyone must know, wanted to just give you a really quick example of how the windmill works. Obviously, we see the bishop lined up directly with the king. In some cases, it might be the queen, who also operates well on diagonals. And we have the rook. With any move it makes right now is going to be a discovered check. However, it's critical to always try to be as aggressive as possible. Look for the most forcing double check. Sometimes that might even be a sacrifice, which you'll see in the different mating patterns we'll get to. But here we just have rook takes f7. And after black moves the king, we're going to go back. That's the key to the windmill is repetition. You go back, reinforcing the discovered check, which unfortunately for your opponent is an unavoidable thing. After we continue to operate in this fashion, you'll see that the rook is going to munch just about everybody along the diagonal. We're going to see that there are other mating nets that occur in this repeated windmill / discovered check idea. That's, again, I've already alluded to them a couple times. This is really just to show you the windmill in action, and eventually white would likely climax this idea with winning the rook on a8. Noted should be that moving the rook anywhere along the g-file rather than the 7th rank is not as effective, not only because there's nothing we can really grab here, but after the king moves to the h7 square, we don't have the ability to force a repetition anymore because the king has been more or less let out of the box he was in on the 8th rank. The king can now go to h6, and the position is still going to require some work. So if you had played the rook to the g-file at any point during this entire mating net, just to back up a few moves to show it, you would have been allowing the king out of the figurative box that the cage that he's in on the 8th rank. So finally, again, so let's just see it. And we climax by winning the rook, so we can move quickly from the windmill to actual mating nets involved in this tactical pattern. And let's do that right now. One of the most basic examples of Morphy's mate that involves the windmill tactical pattern leading to this mate is the one you see here. White starts with the move rook takes g7, and after the move king to h8, only move, obviously we take the f7 pawn, releasing the windmill discovered check, only to repeat this pattern, forcing the king back into the corner. And now, obviously, we have our options in terms of where we can move this rook and release the windmill discovered check again. However, the most obvious and most forcing way to lead to a win is to move the rook, in this case, along the g-file, just about anywhere. As when we release the discovered check in this case, we are maintaining a blockade on the king, basically leaving him trapped in the corner. The only move remaining to black is a move like rook f6, and bishop takes f6 as mate. This pattern that you just saw is the Morphy's mate. Again, it starts with a windmill tactic. Oftentimes you can't just take this pawn and immediately fall back to the g-file to release the deadly checkmate. That's because there's still a piece that can block this bishop in the pawn. So it's really critical to see that partly why I showed you the windmill before showing you the Morphy's mate is because usually in a practical setting you have to apply at least a short-term windmill. Maybe you don't have to take every piece along the 7th rank, right? Let's say there were more pieces here. You wouldn't have to take every piece along the 7th rank, but you at the very least had to apply the windmill for one turn to eliminate the key piece that can be used to block the deadly checker along the diagonal. So using the windmill tactic was key to setting up the Morphy's mate. And now again, the rook moves anywhere along the g-file, and we see the Morphy's mate in action, the king being trapped and climaxing with the checkmate here. Let's see another example of how the windmill / Morphy's mate seesaw ideas come into play. Again, we start with the most obvious move. We have the bishop and rook lined up on this diagonal. For clarity's sake, or let's say to exaggerate our motif, we put the bishop all the way on the other side of the board, showing you that it doesn't matter how close your bishop is. We start with this check. Obviously continue with at least one stage of the windmill. Sometimes more is required. An example would be, let's use our imaginations to say there was a knight on d7 where moving now trying to deliver the deadly Morphy's mate wouldn't work, as the knight would have the ability to block on both of these squares. So in that case you might repeat a windmill by giving another discovered check and eliminating yet another piece that can block the bishop. We're using our imaginations here because, let's be honest, sometimes it's a little more fun than the real thing, right? Hey, you know what I'm talking about? No, you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so imagining there's a knight there, you could actually just eliminate it and then back up and give the discovered check. But in this case, there is no other piece that is really capable of blocking, so we move the rook anywhere along the g-file to maintain the cage, maintain the trap on the king. And black can play computer chess here and try to sacrifice every piece along the diagonal before ultimately succumbing to the checkmate. Let's see it one more time in action, Captain. Again, you would see that the windmill pattern could be even further required here if there was yet more pieces that could block, but there isn't. And so we simply move the rook along the g-file and finish with the climax of checkmate after eliminating both the queen and the rook. So there you go with yet another example of how the windmill and Morphy's mate work together. Let's see another one. Quickly, another example before we wrap up the windmill / Morphy's mate pattern is one that doesn't necessarily lead to forced mate, but again shows you the practical setting where you recognize the potential for these types of tactics by seeing the placement of your pieces. Here black has the winning move, rook to e2, exclama viach. Obviously the queen being pinned is the key to the fact that you can put a rook on pre like that. The best move, of course, would be to take this queen. Any other move is going to allow me to take on g2 anyway. And after trading, black can set up a windmill tactic, perhaps grab this c-pawn to ensure that this bishop can't be attacked. Repeat the windmill, and when the time is right, another pawn, of course, could be grabbed. Just capturing back on b6 is good enough for a victory when we see that there isn't any possibility, a little tongue-tied there, for the king to get himself off of this deadly windmill that's going to keep repeating. And so, if it ends up just climaxing and black winning just about every pawn left on the board with a forcing discover check or even more, either way we see that the windmill is effective and it's a borderline mating net. Moving the rook on the g-file wouldn't quite work because the king can get out. Of course, we could repeat the windmill there, but in any case, not quite officially a mating net, but another example of when the windmill and Morphy's mate ideas should be recognized as potentially being there. You start with a brilliant move like rook to e2, setting up the tactical pattern that is one of the most forcing in chess. Let's see where the windmill / Morphy's mate idea first got its name, as we wouldn't really be doing justice to Morphy's mate without showing his first example of using this idea in action. And that, of course, is this position here. This is a famous game, one that Paul Morphy was recognized as, later recognized, of course, as the greatest tactician, one of the best attackers in the history of our game, one of the most creative attackers in the history of our game. And you can debate, obviously, Morphy's place in chess history in terms of how strong he would be if he was in a modern-day setting. But regardless of that, that's not what we're here to debate, the time machine theory. We're not here to do that. We're here to show an example of Morphy's brilliance and his recognition of tactical tension and the possibility to create a mating net against the enemy king here with a brilliant move. Queen takes f3. Double exclam even. Sacrificing the queen for a full bishop or just winning a bishop. but after pawn takes, we see the rook come over with check, and the bishop immediately enter. And we're very close to seeing the Morphy's mating net in action. There's also the Pillsbury mate, which is sort of the exact same type of pattern with the roles reversed of the rook and bishop, but we're going to get to that next. And so here, there are obvious threats, not only the rook, but of course bishop to g2 check, on any sort of simple move here. Bishop g2 check and bishop takes f3 is checkmate. So we see the threat, the idea that Morphy had is pretty obvious and clear and pretty forcing. In this case, his opponent's only and best move was a move like queen to d3, which would have prepared not only to capture back the bishop if need be, but if bishop g2 check and any sort of discovery, now white has the option to give back the queen for the rook and potentially survive the mating attack. So queen d3 was the best move. Of course, after the move f5, blocking the queen from taking the rook, white is still in trouble. We're not going to analyze the position out fully because not the point of showing the mating net in action. But we'll say that black was still doing well here. In the game, however, white decided that saving the rook and trying to create this escape square was the best option. However, after bishop g2 check and taking f3 with check, black has many options to be winning here, including just capturing the rook. Along with playing bishop g2 check back, and you could repeat the idea, but the most forcing of which is one that shows the Morphy's mating net in action, the move rook to g2, threatening not only rook takes f2 check, but also the simple move rook takes h2, followed by rook h1 mate. For example, if a move like d4 was chosen to block the bishop and defend the pawn on f2. After rook takes h2, white can resign. No way to stop mate. So to show the Morphy's mate in action and kind of what he had calculated, we'll see that after a move like this, we take with check, repeat the discovered check. Of course, the move king f1 is also checkmated in one move. And after the king moves, we have the move rook to g1. Double check by both the rook and the bishop on f3. And even though both pieces are capturable, of course, as we know about double check, you can't take two pieces at once. So unless your king has safety, which he does not here, you are busted. So again, Morphy's mate originated from seeing this pattern in action for one of the first times in the history of documented chess, was with this brilliant queen sacrifice, followed by the entry of the bishop and the rook, and the mating net eventually with the rook infiltration, and seeing Morphy's mating idea, the discovered check by the rook and bishop working well together. This was one of the first examples of it, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now what we're going to do is move on. We are going to also show some examples of when the windmill and when these mating nets don't work, as that seemed to be a popular thing in my last video, kind of showing people the practical application of these mating nets sometimes means that there are cases where they don't work, and you have to recognize that as well. So before we show some examples of when the seesaw windmill pattern doesn't work, I want to show you the Pillsbury mating net, which is very similar to the Morphy's mate, but with the roles of the rook and bishop reversed on occasion, and a different type of critical sacrifice, critical idea that makes the Pillsbury mate work. So let's without further ado, let's see our first example of the Pillsbury's mate. Here, of course, we see a position that is strikingly familiar to all of the Morphy's mate examples we've already displayed. And the first thing we recognize before we even talk about the critical tactical idea that separates Pillsbury's mate from Morphy's mate, I want to highlight the one simple thing about this position that makes it different than the examples we've seen, is that in this case, the potential discovered checking piece, the bishop on b2, is actually under fire. What that does is it eliminates the possibility for a straight-up windmill. Moving this rook anywhere just to give one simple discovered check will not be good enough, because the piece that is delivering the discovered check is under fire. That already increases the urgency of how we're going to give the discovered check. What white has to do in these cases is either find a safe square for the piece that could give the discovered check, and hope that there's no way for the opponent to break this bind. In this case, of course, that wouldn't be true. Moving the bishop to a safe square, there's many ways for black to block the diagonal: f6, knight to e5, and d4, to name three of the most obvious. So just moving the bishop to a square that is safe is not going to be good enough. In this case, white is down a large amount of material. The discovered checking piece is under fire. So what do? Well, that's when we look for the more powerful move in this position. In fact, the most powerful move in this position is a discovered double check that actually immediately sets up the Pillsbury mate, and you'll see the difference between this and the Morphy's mate. The move, of course, is rook to g8 check. We sacrifice this rook with double check, and after the black king captures it, of course, being the only move, rook to g1 is check, and after the computer sacrifice on g5, rook takes g5 is mate. Take a look at that again. You see that both the Pillsbury's mate and the Morphy's mate stem from a potential windmill pattern. So again, we're seeing all these things sort of tie in, and we're seeing the rook and bishop work well together. But the key thing about the Pillsbury's mate is that when it works, when the open file, the open G file, or let's say knight file, because it could obviously be on the queen side, G or B, when the open knight file is available, should always be a pattern you consider, this forcing sacrifice of the rook, and follow that with the other rook joining the party, right? We want to be aware of how all of our pieces can potentially coordinate against the enemy king, and the Pillsbury's mate only works when the entire knight file has already been exposed, or in a case where maybe the rook has been lifted to one of these ranks, so it wouldn't matter if the entire knight file was exposed, it could still hop over. But in this case, we see the Pillsbury mate very clearly, a sacrifice of the rook, followed by the other rook joining the party, and we checkmate the black king before he can say William Lombardi. That didn't make any sense. I was looking for something to rhyme with party. I apologize. Next position. Of course, here we see yet another sort of strange-looking position, both sides material being roughly equal, but there's a potential here for the Pillsbury mate that exists. Unlike the last version of the Pillsbury mate, where the rook is the one delivering the final checkmate, that's kind of what separates it from the Morphy's mate pattern. In this case, the bishop will be the one delivering the final checkmate, but the idea of clearing, making a clearance sacrifice to open up the knight file is still the key. The queen takes on f6, brilliant move, sacrificing herself for the knight. Obviously, black can either allow himself to be checkmated or capture here, after which the move rook to g1 check, followed by bishop takes f6 check, is mate. Take another look at that. Chopalicious, Chekalina Lashlamba, checkmate, a Ruski. Another example of the Pillsbury mate. Again, I tie all these things together. You know I've made an effort when I prepared this series. You've seen that in the last two videos. So maybe some of you purists out there will yell at me and say this is actually a Morphy's mate, the other one is a Pillsbury's mate. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is recognize the patterns of how the rook and bishop work well together. Recognize the potential to destroy your opponent's kingside castle position and apply one of these mating patterns. And that's the most important thing, is that they become so subconscious in your approach that you couldn't miss them if you wanted to. This is one that I really enjoyed when I saw, because I had never seen this particular deflection sacrifice before. So even for advanced players, if you haven't seen this exact position, of course, make sure that, as with all the positions, I hope you've been pausing your video and attempting to solve them. If I'm not here to remind everybody and crack the whip that they need to apply themselves in a practical way, then maybe they won't do it. But hopefully you've all been doing that, recognizing that one of the main ideas of this video series is that you really apply yourself and then see, the answer after I explain it, and so all the patterns can really become a part of your thought process. Remember, otherwise all I'm doing is actually just displaying for you tactics that you could find in books, you could find other people cover, you can see them in practical games. The key is that I'm giving them all to you in this sort of theme, this sort of organized themed manner, and if you really apply yourself and try to solve each position, it can really become very, very quickly become a part of your thought process in the best manner, and you can really take your intuition for these types of patterns to the next level. So, all right, so hopefully you paused your video and you've solved this one for white. The brilliant move, the first move, is queen to f3, exclam. I love that move, a great move. In fact, what's funny about this one is that queen to f3 is kind of the only move if white wants to maintain an advantage anyway. You could move the rook, but not only, okay, I guess you wouldn't lose this pawn because check is mate, but the position would remain very unclear. Black could save his rook, and white's still struggling to get castled. It's tricky. It's not over, to say the least. But queen f3 is a brilliant example of how forcing and how dangerous an open exposed knight file when you get the rook and bishop parting together like rock stars, right? When you get those two rocking and rolling together, the open knight file can be such a critical weakness. And in this case, of course, the key idea is that you were deflecting the queen off the knight file so that you could give this check, bring the bishop in check, finish with the discovered check, and give checkmate on the g-file. Let's see that one more time. Queen to f3, exclam, a deflection tactic that takes the queen off of the knight file and delivers the goods in the end. right? Noted should be that, of course, he does not have to take the queen. However, retreating the queen doesn't solve all of Black's problems, of course. There's a number of things White can do here to keep the attack going. I think the most forcing of which might be a move that, let's say, guards the bishop and actually attacks the knight. When you follow that quickly with the king castling long and the rooks finding themselves connected, let's say coming over, the rooks find themselves connected, and the knight file is still a serious issue for Black. I guess, of course, the other answer is that I could just take the rook on f8 and be up the exchange, but I wanted to show that seeing the potential dangers for your opponent on the knight file and keeping the pieces on the board is certainly another option here for White. So a really, really fun position, a pattern that I really enjoyed seeing, and a deflection tactic that I will certainly keep in my own back pocket. Finally, here we make our transition into windmills and Pillsbury mates, Morphy's mates, seesaw patterns, whatever name you want to apply to when these tactical patterns don't necessarily work. We're going to show one that was specifically categorized after a world champion next, and see a few examples of the Petrosian's draw method, where the windmill is used in a defense manner. But before we get to that, I'm just going to show you a very simple example here where, yes, you have a very powerful windmill. Yes, you would love for either, Morphy's mate or Pillsbury's mate to exist here, but a sacrifice of the rook does absolutely nothing because there's nobody to give check and deliver the goods. And using the windmill tactic to take material would only work if your opponent was about to make a huge blunder here and repeat with the king and allow you to take yet another piece with the windmill tactic. Even here, it's actually not mate because I can still block, but the point is I don't have to do that. After you've taken f7, I have one obvious move that simply blocks the diagonal, and we see that there's a defensive x-ray happening here. Though we have these two attackers, I also have two defenders because the rook and the knight are operating together to guard f6. If I take here, I can take back with the knight, and my rook guards the knight on f6 through your piece. That's why we call it an x-ray. And, of course, any other move would not be satisfactory for White either, as I'm threatening to take your bishop. So here we see an example where the windmill was fun, but if you had made some sort of sacrifice to set up this tactic, always be aware of the inner position, your opponent interfering with the powerful diagonal here by just simply blocking it with a piece. And that's the most simple example of when a windmill doesn't work. Let's move on to the Petrosian's draw. In this great example, we see White having the potential for a windmill tactic, and so the first move is fairly obvious, playing this move rook to g7 check. However, what you quickly recognize, and likely did before we even played rook g7 check, is that White has to be very careful here. As excited as we get when we see this pattern, the point is that if you move the rook anywhere but the key squares, I'm going to be taking your bishop with check. So, a move like this not only would not deliver mate because I take with check, but after that I'll quickly capture your other piece. So we see that in this case you recognize the potential, that you had the potential for a windmill, but because the position of your other pieces are so awkward, the bishop being pinned, I even have threats, of course, of coming down here. And so this case, this I don't know why this became known as the Petrosian draw. It was a defensive method, but nonetheless the key move is rook to d7 check, exclam, forcing the king back to g8, and at the same time cutting off the rook on d8's gaze of the bishop. That's the key here, is that in this scenario, White can give the windmill check forever, not as a means to win material, but rather as a means to play defense against the bishop. Noted should be that without this check and discovered check, which is of course used for defensive purposes, any other move here would lose for White. I can't defend the bishop any other way. Even if I could for one move, I probably couldn't deal with all the other threats that Black would have in this position. So this case, it's not just that this is a fancy way to defend, this is actually the only way to defend, and we see the windmill used for defensive purposes, known as the Petrosian draw, and a really good thing to add to your database of knowledge in your head. In this rather unorthodox position, White's defensive resources are sort of surprising. But the key here is that despite White's material advantage, White is actually the one in trouble, right? Because of the powerful battery that we have lined up here, the bishop and the rook lined up for the deadly windmill. Any move here would not only probably be potentially subject to windmill tactics, maybe, but really more importantly is I'm threatening to check anywhere along the g-file and deliver the goods with a Morphy's mate. So what exactly can White do here to have the chance of defending? The move rook to f6, exclam, is the only option. The key is that black will never find a safe square that is, let's say, safe from more attacks from white. After the bishop moves to b7, I attack you. After you move to f3, I attack you. If you move to a8, I'll take here and attack you, and all I've done there is just won another pawn. I can't really do anything else, but the point is that this cat and mouse game of the rook attacking the bishop will repeat. And as much as black would love to move and give any kind of discovered check, this normally being an example of Morphy's mate, you can't do it because the discovered checker is under fire. Same would be anywhere, of course, along this rank. So rook f6 is an exclam move, and it's white recognizing that despite his material advantage, he's actually the one needing to find defensive resources here. And white will play cat and mouse with the light square bishop for the rest of the game, or until his opponent surrenders to a repetition of moves. Moving the rook to g3 or f2 here to try to give this discovered check is possible, but giving up this rook for the bishop is not an issue here, because you could argue that white is actually the one playing for a win in this ending with two pieces against the rook on f3. So again, cat and mouse attacking the potential discovered checker is one key way to defend against a windmill. Moving on from the Morphy's mate, seesaw, Petrosian's draw, Pillsbury's mate, all that mess of junk that we just looked at, which of course is absolutely critical and maybe the most common way the rook and bishop work together to deliver the goods with with a mating net or a pattern that can win a large amount of material. But before we move on to different ideas, particularly highlighted with the rooks, we're gonna continue with the theme of this video, which is ways that the rooks are involved in mating nets and tactical patterns around the king. I wanted to show one more central example, rather than an example of how the rook and bishop work together against a castled king. This is a very famous and a very important pattern to be aware of how the rook and bishop work together against the uncastled king. I'm only going to give one example because it's pretty straightforward, but it's a very fun example, a very famous one, and one that you want to commit to your memory just as much as you do the windmill and the Pillsbury mate, as well as the other ideas that were associated with the last ones we did. Here, of course, you've probably already seen it if you paused your videos. Even if not, it's a pretty straightforward one, a very famous tactic that exposes black's lack of development. Despite white being down material here in this famous position, white has all the pieces of exactly where they need to be with the first move, winning move, queen to d8, double exclam of Iach, sacrificing the queen. Only move is king takes d8. Now, if you saw that idea, make sure you were aware that there was only one follow-up, one discovered check follow-up that actually works. There are two available, but only one of them actually delivers the mate in a forcing manner, and of course that is bishop to g5 check. If the king moves to the 8th rank, now you see the bishop and rook work together to guard d8, and the rook is the one delivering the final blow. If the king moves to c7, which should be noted is the only other safe square, despite the fact that the bishop is hanging and there are multiple ways to block it, again, remember, that's the key and the reason why a discovery with the rook and the bishop is often so powerful, because there's only one way to get out a double check, and that, again, is to move the king. So no other squares are available besides c7, and in this case, the bishop is the piece that delivers the final goods. You see the bishop delivering the checkmate, and both pieces working together to guard all the critical squares for the enemy king. So taking a look at it again from the beginning, the queen sacrifices herself in order to force the king, the decoy tactic that forces the king onto the square he absolutely does not want to be on. We follow that with the correct discovered check. Of course, this check allowing multiple ways to get out, but even this move doesn't succumb to mate because the king can escape, and this move, of course, also gets out. So bishop to g5 check. If the king runs this way, the bishop delivers the mate. You see how the rook and bishop work together here. If the king maintains the 8th rank, the bishop guards the rook instead, and this is a really good example of seeing the different ways the rook and bishop work together, protecting each other and sort of switching roles, like the Pillsbury mate and the Morphy's mate. They sort of switch roles in terms of who does the actual checkmating, who delivers the final blow, but it's very, very powerful when the rook and bishop work together against the exposed king. Let's move on. We are classifying this as rook sacrifice against the castled king. You can specify it with rook sacrifices himself along a knight file, whether it's a G or B file, but I would say the destruction of the castled king with a rook sacrifice first. We looked at the Greek gift, of course, and saw ways that the bishop led the way, breaking down the doors. Here we see the rook doing it, and we see how the queen and rook work well together to deliver mates. Rook takes G7. Of course, king takes g7, runs into queen g5 check, queen to f6 check, and rook to g1 checkmate after the computer sacrifice on g3. Noted should be that when you see the potential of all three of the major pieces with the ability to attack the enemy king, you got to look for anything. You've got to look for sacrifices. You've got to look for ways to break down the doors, and it doesn't always mean that it'll work. Remember, we're not giving you the weapons where you can just become a kamikaze warrior all the time. It's just about recognizing the potential and how the pieces coordinate. So here, if the king declined the sacrifice and made another move, there's probably a few different ways for white to deliver the goods here. But obviously the most forcing is just queen to h6, guarding the rook on g7, and black can resign because of the unstoppable threat. Here we see another tactical pattern that would be classified as a rook sacrifice along the knight file, where the rook leads the way against the destruction of the enemy king's castle position. Rook takes g7 check. Of course, declining the sacrifice would not be an option, as I can take this pawn with check, and I'm defended by the bishop, followed by probably multiple ways to mate. So taking is your only move, after which I play queen g4 check, and then line up with the bishop to create a mating net battery that is unescapable. Noted should be that a move like this would not be as effective after the move f5, sacrificing the pawn, and at the same time releasing the queen for a very timely defense. So always be accurate after you've sacrificed a large amount of material. Don't just assume that your opponent's castle position is going to fall apart and checkmate himself, okay? The key is to find the key square for the queen and bishop, and usually the most forcing pattern of a queen and bishop lining up together is a battery, which is where the bishop supports the queen in entering against the king. Of course, the only move that would literally postpone the mate for one move would be this sacrifice, but of course there's nothing black can do against this threat. Once again, see it in action. Bam, slam, jam, cram, thank you, ma'am. Next position. Let's see it one more time from black's perspective. We start out with the move rook takes g2, of course, sacrificing along the knight file. Declining the sacrifice would only really postpone the inevitable after a strong move like queen to h3, attacking the knight, preparing to bring the other rook to the g file, and a move like this wouldn't even stop the mate. Perhaps the most forcing idea is just to bring the knight in immediately. Attacking this guy, of course, moving the knight is not an option, and white's not going to live to see the light of day in a few moves. So king takes g2, and we see the pattern once again climax with the queen leading the way, followed by the rook delivering the goods along the exposed knight file. There we go. Let's move on to the next pattern with the rooks. We're going to classify the next few mating nets as either single or double rook sacrifices. I've also heard the name Damiano's mate used. It's something that classified it, but not a pattern that I ever really gave a name to, just something that was seen as kind of an ultimate clearance sacrifice, where you sacrifice a rook or sometimes two rooks along an exposed open file in order to clear the way for other pieces. So the next few positions, again, the theme I want you to associate with is either a single or double rook sacrifice, with the idea I would classify it as a mating net clearance sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice along an open file to clear the way for other pieces to deliver the final blow. And so here we see the first example of it, rook leading the way with this brilliant sacrifice on h8. The king or the bishop can take, and either one is going to meet the same fate. King takes, I guess, allows it in a little bit more forcing manner. I check and give mate. Bishop takes, though, leads to the same thing. After I come to h1, there's nothing you can do to block the h file, and you're gonna find yourself checkmated here within just a couple moves. Next example, a very simple version of the same type of idea. Sacrifice along the open file, an ultimate decoy. King has to take it, which allows us to deliver the mate on h7. Checking right away, of course, would lead to a very unclear position. Once again, this mating net is very common, sacrificing the rook, forcing the king onto a square he doesn't want to be on, and letting the queen deliver the final blow. If you haven't paused your clocks, hurry up and do so. This is a very, very complicated but a much more advanced version of the same type of idea. Again, we sacrifice the rook on the open file, king takes being the only move, after which the queen finds herself right where she needs to be. We eliminate the final defender of the castle position, and black can resign as mate is coming. Once again, you see the potential for this with, as I said, I like to call them the ultimate clearance sacrifice, clearing a square, clearing a passageway from one of your other pieces. The rooks do it so well on open files, and then we eliminate the last defender, and the game is over, Red Rover. Our final single rook sacrifice we're going to show is one we have to, because it's not one that we would necessarily classify as a clearance sacrifice, but rather a deflection. Here what you're doing is you're recognizing that you have potential for all of your pieces to come against the king, but the order in which you do so is very important. Without forcing moves, you may not actually get at this guy, as black also has his own counterplay here. So the key move here is a rook sacrifice once again. Again, I told you the next few positions would be single or double rook sacrifices. We started out with this sort of ultimate clearance sacrifice. Here we see we're sacrificing the rook along a 7th rank to actually deflect the king away from a critical square. Now we can take f7, and either way the king goes, we're delivering mate on h1. One more time, just for kicks and gigs. We see it in action, followed by checkmate on h1. Our first example of the double rook sacrifice, Damiano's mate, I believe it's called, is a really fun one. We see that the forcing moves here, well, they better be coming because our opponent is threatening checkmate himself. So white to play and win. We start with one rook sacrifice, clearing the way for the second rook to get involved. When that rook sacrifices himself, we aren't just being crazy and postponing the inevitable, but rather we actually had real purpose behind those 2 rook sacrifices to clear this open file and square for the queen, allowing us to deliver the mate on h7. One more time, a really fun example of 2 rooks sacrificing themselves to clear the way for the greater good, in this case, the queen finding herself on the h-file so she can deliver checkmate. Finally, we climax the Damiano's idea, the single and double rook sacrifices, with one that was borderline, could have been classified under the Taimanov's knight sacrifice pattern that we did back, I believe, in the first Mating Nets video, but not quite the same, as there's no bishop involved here on a diagonal, no bishop for black guarding critical squares. So rather, this is one that really does get classified under the double rooks doing their thing. We start with this brilliant move, knight to g3 check. Of course, winning the queen is what we're threatening, and probably was white's best option was to just give up the queen. But, of course, your opponent isn't going to do that. They're going to take it and make you prove it. In this case, black is sacrificing both rooks along the h-file once again. And once again, we see a climax very similar to the last position, with the queen delivering the final blows along the open file. Pretty cool, pretty fun. I really like this one because, wow, that just rhymed, didn't it? Anyway, pretty cool, pretty fun. I really like this one because it shows really a view of all your potential. When you see all your pieces right now, you wouldn't really, if you weren't aware of this kind of mating pattern, you wouldn't consider a sacrifice. You'd see them as, wow, my pieces are all in the back rank and I got to be defending against my opponent's threats. But you become aware of these sort of patterns, and moves like this become a part of your thought process, and they can often end with just absolute, brilliant wins, and lots of fun to find a sacrifice of both a knight and 2 rooks to deliver a mate like that. Finally, though we're pushing almost 40 minutes with this rook-themed Mating Nets, I'm sure all you guys are really happy. For me, it means that maybe really went overboard with the material, but I kind of had to have at least one video that was really long like this, so why not make it a weekend feature if we were going to ever fit all the material I prepared into this Mating Nets portion. There's just so many good things, so many critical things you got to be aware of to be a strong chess player. So I hope you don't mind the longer video. Hope you're excited to watch it over this weekend. And like I said, any Mating Net themed video series, when we're talking about the rooks, would be incomplete if we didn't talk about the back rank checkmate idea. Perhaps the most famous, the most fundamental, the most basic way that a rook uses his powers against the enemy king is exposing a weak back rank. In this position, white simply captures the knight on e5, a brilliant move that wins a piece and usually forces a resignation from your opponent. But if he's stubborn and wants to take the queen and see what your idea was, well, we'll show him that idea by delivering a back rank checkmate. Recognizing a weak back rank for your opponent is probably one of the most fundamental things you need to do to be a strong chess player, because there's so many tactical patterns. You could classify this as a decoy or a deflection. You're sacrificing the queen temporarily to decoy or deflect the rook away from his main purpose of guarding a weak back rank. There's so many different ways you can expose your opponent if they leave their back rank undefended. And so being aware that the rook's potential to expose an opponent's back rank is one of the most fundamental things that he does well is really important. So let's see a few more examples of the back rank before we bring this particular video installment to a close. Here's a great example where white recognizes the potential to expose his opponent's weak back rank, especially because he has another piece involved in the assault. Starts off with the move queen takes f7, a sacrifice of the queen, and after black obviously has to capture back, otherwise he'll be mated in one anyway. White delivers the goods along the back rank here, not a most traditional back rank mating pattern because the king isn't hemmed in only by his own pawns, but it's still a back rank mating net. The bishop helps us by pinning the rook on f7, and black can make a couple sacrifices if he wants to delay the inevitable, but the bottom line is the position was a forced mate in 4, starting with the sacrifice on f7. Our next back rank idea comes to us courtesy of another queen sacrifice. Rather than the bishop being involved to pin a rook, here we use an X-ray tactic, or I guess you could say just all of our pieces being in the right place at the right time. We sacrifice on d7, and after rook takes d7, infiltrate with the other rook, and we can pick our ways to win, left-handed or right-handed, depending on what you are. We take on d8, and it is mate. And there it is again. I am just a rhyming machine today. Okay, our final back rank pattern comes to us with this example, and it is one that shows the back rank involved with another tactical theme you've already seen in the previous videos, an X-ray tactic. One of the most common ways you actually expose a back rank, by the way, so I'm glad we're ending with this. Whenever you see something as weak as your opponent's king being trapped along a back rank, again, that's one of those get-out-of-jail-free cards I like to say that allows you to consider everything. The key to these patterns is considering everything when the highest stakes are involved. You can't sacrifice pieces willy-nilly if you're playing positional chess, but if your opponent's king is involved and you don't consider all the forcing moves, well then that's shame on you. So even if every sacrifice doesn't work, you're required, and it's a get-out-of-jail-free card to consider sacrifices. Here we see the X-ray tactic come into play. Queen takes f1 check, sacrificing the queen temporarily, exclamaviach. And after we see that, of course, the rook and the queen are defending each other through the enemy piece. That's why it's an X-ray tactic. Rook takes f1, rook takes f1, Cecchina Lashlamba. One more time for good measure, and we call it a day. So I hope you enjoyed this, so far I believe one of the longest installments we've had in the Patterns Everyone Must Know video series. Today's theme was mating nets with the rook, of course, being the main player. We started with the Morphes and Pillsbury mates that, of course, are directly associated with the windmill tactical pattern. We saw different examples of when the seesaw didn't work. We saw Petrosian's draw idea, using the windmill tactic as a defensive resource. We moved on to the different types of sacrifices the rook can do to destroy a castle-king position. That, of course, were the rook sacrifices along a knight file I classified as rook sacrificing to destroy a castle-king position. And then we did the single and double rook sacrifices along exposed files to either deflect or create clearance space for your other pieces. And we ended, of course, with one that you cannot miss if you're talking about rook-associated mating net themes, right? Mating nets that directly involve the rook. That, of course, is back rank tactics. So, all right, I hope you're looking forward to our next installment, and we're going to see you around on chess.com.